Just before we start this week's Let's Talk, just want to highlight these 3 rackets here. Got kind of like almost 3 generations of Dunlop squash rackets, and I recently bought this for my birthday, and it is a brand new Max 700i, and I'm super excited about giving it a test. So sometime next year I'll be reviewing all of those. Anyway, last week's question was what advice would you give yourself if you could give yourself advice when you first started playing? And I'm going to continue that theme, but it's kind of be like the opposite. This week's Let's Talk Squash is, what's the worst piece of advice you've ever been given about squash? Now, it could have come from an older player, somebody with more experience. It could have come from somebody who hasn't played as much as you. It could have even come from me. It could have come from anybody else. Where it comes from doesn't matter. What's important is that the advice that you get is good for you. So don't think that because somebody has said it, that's maybe a famous person or is very experienced, that advice is necessarily good for you. In fact, I've received advice from world champions that's turned out to be very bad for me. So if I were to think about the worst piece of advice that I was ever given, it's what we say in English is a double-edged sword, which means there's kind of 2 sides to it. So the worst piece of advice I was given was, don't let the ball bounce twice, don't hit the tin, and don't hit it out. Oh my God, that sounds so obvious, I said to myself at the time. I've now solved squash, or this person has solved it and told me the solution. That's all I need to do. And I suppose technically that's hard to argue with, isn't it? I mean, if you don't hit it out, if you don't let it bounce twice and you don't hit the tin, you're going to win. Unless, of course, you come across you play somebody who does exactly the same thing, and that's a different story. It's the old, what happens when an unstoppable force hits an immovable object. But it does make sense, and you do think that's it. That's a simple piece of advice. But it's bad advice, because what does it make you do? Well, it makes you simply keep the ball going. Another phrase in English is you become a hacker. A hacker is just somebody who just hits the ball and doesn't really care where it goes. And squash is so much more than that. And it reminds me, and any other Star Trek fans here, it reminds me of an episode from The Next Generation where Data was playing a board game against this alien race, and he couldn't beat them. And Geordie, the guy with the eyes and the sensor, whatever it was, said to him, well, maybe you're approaching this wrong. You're trying to win. Maybe you should just not lose. Try not to lose. And I think that that's the same kind of idea here. By not hitting the tin, by not hitting it out, and by not letting it bounce twice, all you're doing is you're trying not to lose. And squash should be about looking for openings, looking for situations, taking advantage of those situations. So it's one of those things that might sound like a good idea at first, and maybe you try it and it might bring some success. But ultimately, it's not really a good thing for you to do. You shouldn't just be not hitting the tin, not hitting it out, and not letting it bounce twice. You should be creating opportunities. So anyway, so that was probably, I mean, I don't remember every piece of advice, and I'm sure you don't either. That's probably the worst piece of advice I've been given. Now, you tell me what yours was, and if it was one of mine, tell me, and that's okay, because I honestly believe that the advice I give is good advice, but it might not work for everybody. I accept that. So if you've had a negative experience with some of my advice, let me know and we can talk about it. Anyway, I'm interested to hear your pieces of bad advice. On the screen at the moment, somewhere up here, is a playlist of all of the other questions for you to look at. And probably down here somewhere is another video that YouTube thinks is a really good fit for you. And probably down here is a subscription button. If and only if you think my content is useful, please consider subscribing. And remember, do something every single day to improve your squash. See ya.